Edelgard has always been obsessed with you. I am a little envious, to be frank. I will just have to impress her with my skills on the battlefield. Here is something to believe in! Ah!
Yep, that's me. You're probably wondering how I got myself into this situation. Well,
I am Ferdinand Von Aegir.
Ferdinand Von Aegir is a character whose primary goal in life is to live up to the title of nobility that he was fortunately granted at birth. Being a student of the Black Eagle's house makes him serve as a foil to Edelgard and her conceptions of the nobility in his desire and ability to live up to his status. Characters within the game and players alike will initially think that Ferdinand is just another superficial and narcissistic noble, but as they spend more time with him, they'll come to appreciate his earnest goal to be an ideal noble for the sake of improving the world. Ferdinand as a character is somebody who wants to take a more active role than he is able to, and while his optimism and competitive spirit are useful and reflective of his genuine noble nature, they aren't enough to keep up with the indomitable will of Edelgard, which creates a fundamental conflict within his conception of himself. Ferdinand's most prominent character trait from the outset of the game is his determination to outmatch Edelgard, and Edelgard herself comments on it within her description of him.
For some reason, he thinks of me as a bitter rival and is always trying to challenge me. It's terribly irritating.
And in his early supports with Edelgard, all he tries to do is to prove his superiority to her because he believes his role within the Empire as the Prime Minister's son and a noble is to surpass her. Eventually, after bothering her incessantly, Edelgard accepts his challenge to a duel and Ferdinand finally gets a chance to prove his worth, but it doesn't exactly go as he planned.
All right, Edelgard, have at me!
As you wish.
It only took you one blow? How?
He continues to obsess over besting Edelgard in his sea support with Byleth, where he tries to fight a demonic beast by himself to prove himself to his professor. This drive to compete with Edelgard also applies to his general philosophy on politics and ethics, and he explains this in thorough detail in his final support with Edelgard. He tells her that the reason he values the nobility so highly is because they are placed within an environment that gives nobles the resources to succeed, while also being competitive in that nobles have to succeed to inherit their titles. Ferdinand's belief in himself and the nobility doesn't come from an unfounded belief in intrinsic superiority that they possess, but rather that it's his duty and nobles' duties to always strive to be better than their counterparts. And it's this very belief system that creates conflict between Ferdinand and Hubert within their supports. Ferdinand seeks to create a competitive environment in which people can shine, but Hubert seeks to control and guide people to his desired results. The key disagreement between the two is really centered around the passionate optimism of Ferdinand and the cold and controlling pragmatism of Hubert. In their sea support, they both criticize each other on the affectation of these fundamental differences and are unable to truly understand one another or the motivations behind each other's actions. And it ends up being pretty entertaining to see Ferdinand basically call Hubert a simp and to see Hubert constantly eat away at Ferdinand's status. Later, Ferdinand catches Hubert disobeying one of Edelgard's orders, and another conflict ensues between the two that begins to get at the root of the more fundamental differences between them. Ferdinand is outraged that Hubert would subvert Edelgard's authority because of his loyalty to her, but Hubert objects.
All that I do for her. I seem to recall you expressing a similar sentiment. It is our role to guide her when she is on the wrong course of action. Is that not what you said?
You're not supposed to do it in secret. When you disagree with your leader, you must voice your concerns directly. Otherwise, what is the point?
The point is the same. Lady Edelgard's best interests are served whether she knows it or not. She needs not trouble herself with the mundane details of my actions. Only results matter.
Ferdinand and Hubert both have fundamental disagreements on the ethical conduct for leaders within the Empire, with Ferdinand placing emphasis on the means by which events happen, and Hubert fixating upon the results. Ferdinand's position here is very reflective of his noble sensibilities, where he believes the most important thing is to openly push Edelgard to make better decisions for herself. Through the means of thorough and competitive discourse, Ferdinand hopes to find the ideal answer through competition, which is reflective of his deep belief in the strength of competition, as shown in his final support with Edelgard. Eventually, in their A support, Ferdinand and Hubert both come to appreciate one another better after they realize the virtues behind the fundamental traits that they both possess. Hubert acknowledges Ferdinand's profound optimism and persistence, and Ferdinand comes to understand Hubert's analytical nature, with the final A+ support showing the deep mutual appreciation that they both have through gifting each other their favorite drinks. Just as Ferdinand doesn't necessarily love the coffee that he gifts Hubert, he also doesn't completely agree with Hubert's contrasting viewpoint. However, he is now able to appreciate its virtues, and thus is able to start a fruitful friendship with him. As shown in his supports with Hubert, Ferdinand has a penchant for being open-minded and learning about the legitimacy of different personal philosophies, and comes to ultimately incorporate these new ideas into his overarching philosophy of competition. In his supports with Petra, he realizes that he was ignorant to the strengths of foreign combat, and reassesses some of his presuppositions of the world. Ultimately, he and Petra bond through learning a lot about their respective cultures, and once again Ferdinand reasserts his belief in environmental influences, just like in his support with Edelgard. Ferdinand also has a similar interaction with Caspar, where they both have different views of justice, Ferdinand's being thoughtful and Caspar's being instinctual, and Ferdinand eventually comes to realize that he can incorporate some of Caspar's personal philosophy into his application of justice when he's able to save a shopkeeper because of it. Even though Ferdinand grows to be more open-minded through the game, he does have moments where he gets too ahead of himself and can undermine his own attempts at helping people and his own personal philosophy. In his support with Bernadetta, he tries to push her to leave her room, but she freaks out about it as usual and he gets nowhere. He later realizes his mistake and acknowledges his fault in trying to force her to change instead of helping her make that decision herself. Ferdinand has a similar misstep in his support with Constance, where he lets his noble presumptuousness get to his head and comes off as rude to her when discussing the loss of her noble status. Eventually, they reconcile because Ferdinand realizes his mistake in approach due to having his noble status changed in some way as well after Edelgard's revolution. They both end up deciding to work at ascending to even greater heights than their nobly family was at before. In his support with Marianne, Ferdinand is once again presumptuous and makes the mistake of criticizing her pessimism and imposing his conception of noble obligations onto her without understanding her perspective. Eventually, he comes to understand her pessimism is rooted in her fatalistic view of her own life and how she was placed with unfortunate burdens that she had no choice in. He then clarifies his initial statement about noble obligations in a more understanding way by telling Marianne that she has a purpose to fulfill that she can pour her effort into to overcome the tragic burdens of her life, fully empowering her instead of imposing his noble framework onto her. Finally, in his supports with Mercedes, Ferdinand once again imposes his noble framework onto situations that seemingly don't need it, and ends up boring Mercedes with his speeches. He ends up trying to save Mercedes from her abusive noble family, but Mercedes tells Ferdinand that she needs to face her familial problems herself, or else she'll never really properly address them, and she points out that this is his very own philosophy. In these supports, Ferdinand shows that even though he can cause problems with his bumbling attempts at help, he always tries to do what he understands is the right thing, and frequently reassesses his positions or the way he presents himself to improve. However, the problem with Ferdinand's nobility is that it's contextualized around the social landscape of Fodlan, as his behavior and status leads people to make assumptions about him that are predicated upon negative conceptions of nobles throughout Fodlan. Because Ferdinand himself strongly affirms the legitimacy of the nobility and acts in a way befitting of such affirmation, he constantly appears to others as an aloof and shallow individual, when in reality it's quite the opposite. In the case of Linhart, Ferdinand tries to once again push him out of his comfort zone to live up to his noble potential, and Linhart sarcastically comments on Ferdinand's noble attributes. This interaction continues Linhart's theme of not caring about nobility, and he simply affirms Ferdinand in his aspirations to nobility and patronizes him by making him believe that he's really living up to being a great noble. Later in their B support, Ferdinand tries once again to get Linhart to work, and Ferdinand ends up chasing Linhart all around the monastery. After they're both exhausted, Linhart genuinely appreciates a virtue of Ferdinand's that goes beyond the superficial qualities of his nobility.
You always give everything your all, don't you?
And what is wrong with that?
Nothing whatsoever, Ferdinand. I mean that.
In Ferdinand's supports with Dorothea, she initially despises him due to how perfectly he fits within her conceptions of how nobles act, but he continually works to win her affection over and shows just how genuine and kind he really is. There is an eventual confrontation where Dorothea reveals that she had met Ferdinand before, and she felt that he looked down on her just like all nobles had done to her before. and so she thinks that his kindness at the academy was just a disingenuous front, like all other nobles put up once she became useful to them. He objects and clarifies that he only looked at her that way because she was so stunning, and he ran because of how overwhelmed he was. The game doesn't make it clear whose perception of events is more valid, but from what we've seen about Ferdinand so far, I think it's safe to say that he's probably telling the truth, as it lines up with his bumbling yet kind behavior. Finally, Ferdinand's father deeply impacts his conception of the nobility, and seems to have influenced Ferdinand's conviction to work to be the best noble that he could be, in contrast to the poor example that his father set. And even though he disapproves of his father and his actions, as a noble, he still deeply cares about him, and is filled with grief when he hears about his father being murdered. Finally, Ferdinand's greatest piece of personal growth is found within his B and A supports with Byleth, where he comes to realize his inferiority in contrast to Edelgard. All of Ferdinand's actions and personal philosophy are oriented towards having him work towards becoming an ideal primary actor who can cause the positive change in the world that there needs to be through just means. But time and time again, when it comes to comparing himself to Edelgard's achievements and taking direct action, he comes up short.
The disparity between Edelgard and myself is obvious. She never stops moving forward, single-minded, never wavering. But where does that leave me? Here, flailing about, going nowhere, contributing nothing.
Ferdinand always oriented his life towards being the primary actor who can achieve anything by sheer force of will alone, but it becomes evident to him that that's not his lot in life, because Edelgard does it herself effortlessly, while he doesn't. But in his A support, he comes to realize that people can be highly useful in the world without being a primary actor like Edelgard, but can work behind the scenes to achieve great ends. Ferdinand finally accepts his lot in life as somebody who can't beat Edelgard's sheer force of will, but can still do good according to his own ability. Ferdinand Von Aegir as a character is really compelling because he seems to have all the workings of a main lord, yet an integral part of his characterization is that he doesn't have the same strength or willpower that someone like Edelgard does to make it happen. But Ferdinand still lives up to his ideals in an alternative way, where he isn't the primary actor in saving the day, but is someone who empowers people and facilitates greater change happening through sound advice. For all of his missteps, Ferdinand is truly the noblest of nobles, and by the end of the game he has worked past his ego issues and accepts and works with who he is to do real good in the world. Hey, thanks for watching my video on Ferdinand Von Aegir. I think he's a really interesting character, so I hope you guys have insight into him, and be sure to comment what you thought in the comments below. Also, like and subscribe because it helps me make more videos, and until next time.